It begins with a tablet, not a battlefield. In a museum gallery where the air is steady and the light is controlled, a piece of clay rests behind glass. It is incomplete. The top half of a larger story, its edges broken as if time lifted it and set it down too hard. The surface is the colour of baked earth, and yet the wedge marks remain sharp enough to catch a faint shine when you shift your head by even a few degrees. If you are listening to this in the dark or with a screen dimmed, tell me quietly in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. A city, a room, a late hour. It helps place this story back into real space. Because the strange thing about these Mesopotamian texts is how physical they remain. They are not ideas floating loose. They are objects, fired clay, measured edges, a weight in the hand, a record that outlives the voice that first recited it. And inside the tradition connected to this tablet lives a scene that sounds at first almost modern in its structure, even though we must not dress it in modern clothes. A group burdened with work, a hierarchy enforcing it, a breaking point reached not in a single shout, but in accumulated days and nights. The story is often summarized with a simple phrase, the rebellion of the Igigi. The Igigi, named as a group of gods, appear in Mesopotamian tradition as beings associated with the upper realm, sometimes contrasted with another group, the Anunnaki. The categories are not fixed in every text, and scholars caution against treating them like tidy lists. Still, the relationship that matters for our title is preserved in one recurring idea, a division of labour and a division of authority. And then, this is where the title presses its claim, there is a refusal, not a gentle complaint, a refusal that forces a response. The old stories do not always present this as a war in the way later ages imagine war. There are no maps, no casualty numbers, no neat chronology. Instead, there is something quieter and perhaps more disturbing, an internal fracture in the divine order itself, a stress test. And the name that stands at the centre of authority in these traditions, again and again, is Enlil. Enlil is not merely a character in a story. In the way Mesopotamian religion and politics intertwined, Enlil is also an office-like presence, a principle of command, of decree, of the ordering wind. When texts place Enlil at the heart of decisions about work, about noise, about the limits placed on humans, they are also describing a model of governance. So when the Igigi rebel against Enlil, what does that mean? Does it mean the younger gods rebelled against a specific deity, or does it mean that a certain kind of authority, top-down command, was challenged by the burden it imposed? And if these stories were copied and preserved century after century by scribes who lived in city-states and served temple households and royal courts, then we have to ask something even more careful. What if the Sumerians and their successors were not inventing this scene as entertainment, but preserving it as a memory, reshaped, ritualized, mythologized, of how order breaks and how order is restored? There is a philosophical thread running beneath our entire investigation. It does not demand belief. It does not demand disbelief. It simply asks permission to consider. What if the earliest civilizations of Mesopotamia understood themselves not as creators of the first order, but as caretakers of an order inherited, restored after crises older than their own living memory? If so, then stories like the Igigi rebellion are not just myths. They are teaching tools. They are warnings. They are explanations for why human life in these texts is bound to work, to service, to building, to maintaining canals and cities and temples. And that brings us to the quiet centre of the promise in your title. Sumerian texts reveal. To reveal does not mean to prove. It means to show something that was already there, pressed into clay, waiting to be noticed. Tonight, we will move slowly through the evidence. We will follow it across genres, creation stories, flood traditions, king lists, and later canonical copies. We will keep returning to the same question in different light, the way an archaeologist turns a small artefact in the hand, letting shadows fall into the wedge marks, and we will do it without rushing to conclusions. Because the most honest way to approach these tablets is to accept that they preserve two things at once. They preserve memory, and they preserve mystery. And somewhere between those two, memory and mystery, stands a scene of burdened beings, a leader named Enlil, and a rupture in the heavens that sounds, faintly, like a strike. Names for the gods above and the gods below. Before we speak of rebellion, we have to speak of categories. Not categories as modern certainty, but as ancient habit, names that shift depending on the scribe, the city, the century. In Mesopotamian religion, the divine world is crowded. It is not a single hierarchy so much as a layered landscape of powers, functions, inheritances, and negotiated relationships. Even within one tradition, the same god can be described in multiple ways. One name can become a title. One title can become a group. The term Igigi appears as a label for a group of gods, and what matters for us is how they are set against another group, the Anunnaki, also called Anunna in some contexts. These are not always synonyms, and they are not always opposites. Scholars have long noted how complicated the relationship is. Sometimes the Igigi are described as gods of the upper realm, while the Anunna are associated with chthonic or underworld functions. Sometimes the terms overlap. Sometimes a major deity seems to move between categories depending on the narrative and purpose of the text. So when we hear Igigi rebellion, we should not imagine a single fixed roster. We should imagine something closer to a social category, like saying the workers, or the elders, or the assembly. Not a clean list of names, but a group identity that can shift over time. The tradition that matters most for this title is the one often called Atra-Hasis, a Babylonian story that exists in multiple versions and is known to modern readers through fragmentary tablets. What is striking about the opening of that tradition is how it speaks. It does not begin with romance or wonder, it begins with work. It tells us, in essence, that when the gods were doing the labour when they bore the loads, the burden was too heavy and the distress too much. It frames the earliest crisis not as a monster or a flood, but as exhaustion. Then the text turns towards structure. It tells us that the 7 great Anunnaki were making the Igigi suffer the work. Whatever else changes between versions, this basic architecture remains: a burdened group and a commanding group, a labour imposed from above. And that is the first reason the rebellion matters, because in this story, the rebellion is not random, it arises from a system. The reason categories matter is because they tell us what kind of conflict this is. If the Igigi are subordinate, then rebellion is a challenge to hierarchy. If the Anunnaki are the decreeing gods, then forcing the Igigi to bear labour is not just oppression, it is cosmic administration. And once we realise that, the title's phrase, Anunnaki War, becomes more subtle. War here may not mean spear against shield, it may mean fracture within administration. It may mean the moment a system stops functioning because one layer refuses to keep carrying the weight. If you look at Mesopotamian cities, Uruk, Nippur, Eridu, Sippar, you see landscapes shaped by labour, canals, fields, levees, temple complexes. Labour was not an abstract concept. It was the difference between life and death, between harvest and famine, between the stability of a city and its collapse into dust. So it should not surprise us that divine stories speak in the language of labour. Myth in Mesopotamia is often an argument in narrative form. It tells you why the world is organised as it is. It answers, why do humans work? Why do kings rule? Why do cities belong to gods? Why does suffering exist? And when a story begins with gods suffering under labour, it is telling us something about the mind of the scribes who preserved it. It is telling us that work is not merely punishment. Work is the foundation of order, and order must be maintained even if the ones maintaining it begin to break. But we must also be careful, because the texts do not always present rebellion as heroism. In Mesopotamian thought, rebellion is dangerous. It threatens stability, it invites consequences, it forces the question, what happens when a subordinate group refuses? The answer given by Atra-Hasis is famous in outline: a solution is found. Humans are created to bear the work instead. But even here, we should not rush. We should pause and notice the implication. If humans are created as an administrative solution to a labour crisis among gods, then human existence is framed as inheritance. Humans inherit a burden that was once carried by divine beings. That is not the same as saying humans were invented out of curiosity. It is saying humans were appointed, and appointment implies a prior order, an older structure, into which humans are inserted. This is where our core philosophical framework begins to breathe. What if Mesopotamian civilization, in its own self-understanding, is not invention, but restoration? If the gods had a system before humans existed, then cities and kingship and work are not human innovations in these stories. They are continuations of a pre-existing plan. And so, when we hear Anunnaki, we should resist turning it into a single sensational answer. The Anunnaki, in the texts, are gods, yet the way the texts speak about them often resembles institutional memory, assemblies, decrees, hierarchies, assigned roles. The most honest way to hold the ambiguity is this: the texts treat these beings as real powers shaping the world. Modern scholarship treats them as elements of religious and literary tradition. We can hold both perspectives without forcing one to collapse into the other. And in that space, between the scribe's reality and our analysis, the Igigi rebellion becomes a clue. Not a proof, a clue, because it suggests that the earliest remembered crisis in the divine world was not an invasion from outside. It was internal. It was about work. And that means the war in your title may be something older than armies. It may be the war between burden and authority. The work was heavy, the distress was much. Imagine a world before humans, not in the way modern imagination renders it with empty landscapes, but in the way Mesopotamian thought renders it, a world already ordered, already divided into domains, already governed by decree. In Atra-Hasis, the earliest stage of existence is not quiet, it is laborious. The gods in this tradition dig canals, they cut channels, they build, they maintain the lifelines of the land. The imagery is deeply Mesopotamian because Mesopotamia itself is a land shaped by water management. To keep a city alive in the alluvial plain, you must move earth, you must guide water, you must repair what breaks. When the story says the gods bore the work, it is speaking in the language of the floodplain. And then it describes distress. Distress is a particular kind of word. It is not a single moment. It is accumulated strain. It is the feeling of a burden that does not stop. If the Igigi are burdened with work by the Anunnaki, then rebellion is not sudden. It is the end of endurance. In many retellings, the rebellion becomes dramatic, fire, siege, confrontation. But even without quoting the most vivid lines, the structure is clear enough from the scholarly framing. The Igigi do not want to work anymore, and the Anunnaki must find a solution. This is where we can begin to speak of evidence and interpretation in a disciplined way. The textual fact, as preserved in scholarly discussion, is that the Atra-Hasis tradition opens with divine toil and establishes a relationship where the Anunnaki impose labour on the Igigi. The mainstream academic interpretation tends to treat this as mythic explanation, an etiological tale explaining why humans exist and why humans work. It places the story within a broader ancient Near Eastern pattern, creation as labour substitution, divine hierarchy mirrored in human society. That interpretation is strong because it matches what myth often does. It explains. But there are problems that remain even within that framework. One problem is the specific nature of the crisis. The story does not merely say the gods desired servants. It begins with labour and distress, as if the system itself had become unsustainable. That reads less like whim and more like breakdown. Another problem is how the solution is framed. Humans are not created as companions or worshippers in the first instance. They are created to bear work. And then there is the question that sits beneath the title you chose. Why preserve a story of rebellion in heaven? If the purpose was only to justify labour, it could have been stated without recounting a divine refusal. A simple decree could have done the job. Humans must work because the gods decreed it. Yet the tradition chooses to dramatise the moment when that decree became necessary. That suggests memory, because societies tend to preserve stories of rupture when rupture matters. So we can consider an alternative possibility, framed cautiously. What if the Igigi rebellion is a mythic preservation of older tensions in Mesopotamian society, tensions around forced labour, corv obligations, and the burden placed on subordinate populations by temple and palace? This does not mean the story is simply propaganda. It means it could carry social memory. In Mesopotamian city-states, forced labour was a reality. Building canals and walls required coordinated effort, often compelled. The state and temple systems depended on mobilising human bodies. A story about divine beings forced into labour, who rebel, might resonate deeply with people who lived under similar conditions. But there is another possibility, and here we step more gently. What if the story is not only social commentary, but a coded memory of political change, a moment when a new order replaced an old one? In that reading, Igigi and Anunnaki become more than mythical categories. They become symbolic placeholders for factions, generations, or classes in an ancient narrative of power transition. And if Enlil stands at the centre as a figure of authority, then rebellion against Enlil becomes a way of narrating the challenge to centralised command. Do we have direct proof? No. But we have a pattern worth noticing. Mesopotamian tradition often encodes political legitimacy into cosmic narrative. Kingship descends from heaven. Cities are founded under divine patronage. Catastrophe divides time. Authority is framed as inherited. And in that tradition, rebellion is not merely chaos. Rebellion is the catalyst that explains why a new arrangement exists. Which brings us to the more unsettling implication. If humans are created after the rebellion to replace the labour of the Igigi, then humans are, in a sense, the outcome of conflict, not the cause of it. We exist, in the story, because the divine order fractured. That is a very different origin story from one where creation is purely benevolent, and it changes the way we read the title's phrase, Anunnaki War. Because perhaps the war is not about outsiders. Perhaps it is about the internal tensions of governance, so intense that even gods could not bear them. And if the Sumerians and Babylonians preserved this story, they may have been preserving not only an explanation for labour, but a memory that authority, when it overburdens its servants, invites revolt, even in heaven. Sippar, a city where stories were archived like tools. There is something fitting about the fact that one of the key physical anchors for this story comes from Sippar. Sippar was a city of the north, associated with the sun god Shamash in many traditions, a place of temples, courts, and archives. The details of its long history stretch across centuries, but what matters for us tonight is not everything Sippar was. What matters is that Sippar was a place where tablets were kept. When you read a museum record for an object like the Atra-Hasis related tablet fragment, you are reminded of how much our modern understanding depends on a chain of custody, excavation, acquisition, cataloguing, preservation, and scholarship. The British Museum record for this tablet gives it a clean identity, object type tablet, museum number 78943, registration 1889,000 426.236. It identifies its find spot as Sippar. It notes it is one of an original set of 3 tablets containing the story of Atra-Hasis. It names its acquisition through Budge's mission in 1889. It places it on display. And in that factual frame, the story becomes less like a floating myth and more like an artifact with coordinates, a fragment that travelled from the earth of Iraq to a gallery in London. This is not a neutral journey. The 19th century was an age of excavation, collection, and imperial competition. European museums filled with tablets, not because ancient Mesopotamians offered them willingly, but because modern powers extracted them. We can acknowledge that without letting it become a distraction, because it matters for how we tell the story. It matters because the Igigi rebellion is not something we learned from a single intact tablet discovered neatly in place. It is reconstructed through fragments, through additions, through scholarly labour that itself resembles the labour described in the texts, careful, repetitive, heavy in its own way. And Sippar matters for another reason. Sippar represents the reality that Mesopotamian texts were not random. They belong to scribal environments, temples, schools, courts, where copying was an act of preservation and transmission. A scribe did not copy a story like Atra-Hasis because it was merely entertaining. A scribe copied what was worth preserving, worth teaching, worth reciting, worth knowing. That raises a quiet question. Why preserve a story where the divine order is disturbed? Some myths present the gods as perfectly ordered from the beginning, but Atra-Hasis begins with disorder, distress, burden, complaint. That suggests the scribes were comfortable preserving complexity. They did not fear that acknowledging conflict would weaken authority. Instead, they used conflict to explain authority. This is a pattern we will see again. The Sumerian king list will present kingship as descending from heaven, yet it will also break history with catastrophe. Flood traditions will preserve divine decision-making that seems severe, even troubling, yet those stories are copied and recopied. And later first millennium libraries will preserve these traditions again, collecting them like tools, like instruments of knowledge. So Sippar is not only a find spot, Sippar is a symbol of the archive, a reminder that this is not just a myth we tell ourselves, it is a tradition someone chose to keep alive. When the tablet record tells us it is part of a set, it hints at completeness once possessed. Multiple tablets, multiple chapters, a longer narrative arc. We see only what survives. And what survives often shapes what we think the story meant. This is one reason we have to move slowly. Because the Igigi rebellion, as a scene, is always partly reconstructed. The most vivid moments may be the ones most damaged, most lost, and yet, even in fragments, the shape is visible, work, distress, refusal, and solution. In a city like Sippar, where law and judgment and divine light mattered, the preservation of this narrative suggests it served as more than a bedtime story. It may have served as a model of cosmic justice, a warning about overburdening, a justification for why humans must work, and perhaps, quietly, a reminder that even the gods in these traditions were bound by systems they did not entirely control. Because if the Anunnaki had to find a solution, then authority was not unlimited. Authority was constrained by reality, even divine reality. And if that is true, then we are not looking at a story about a one-time rebellion. We are looking at a story about how systems reach breaking points, which leads us naturally to the floodplain of Nippur, where another tablet preserves a different kind of crisis, one that divides time itself, Nippur's flood tablet, and the quiet authority of Enlil's city. To understand why Enlil matters in this title, we have to understand Nippur. Nippur was not always the most politically dominant city, but it held an authority of a different kind. It was associated with Enlil, and in many periods to be legitimate was to be recognised in relation to Nippur's sacred prestige. This is not merely theology. In Mesopotamia, theology and politics are braided. So when we turn to a tablet from Nippur, an old Babylonian flood tablet, preserved today in a museum collection, we step into a world where stories carry the weight of legitimacy. This particular tablet is catalogued as CBS 1673 from Nippur, dated around 1650 BCE. The museum description notes that it deals with the creation of humans, antediluvian cities and their rulers, and the flood. It preserves a passage in which Enki reveals the plan to destroy humanity by means of a flood to Ziusudra, a king, urging him to heed advice. It describes storms and flood lasting 7 days and 7 nights, then sacrifice, then the granting of eternal life by An and Enlil. Even without quoting line by line, the shape is unmistakable: divine decision, human consequence, survival through warning, restoration through ritual. What matters for our investigation is not that this is about the flood, it is about how Mesopotamian tradition frames catastrophe as something decreed and managed. And notice who appears at the end: An and Enlil, granting eternal life. Enlil, again, is involved in decree and outcome. So when we place the Igigi rebellion against this broader landscape, we see that Enlil is associated with decisions that shape human existence. In one tradition, the burden of labour becomes intolerable and the system seeks a solution. In another tradition, human noise and proliferation, depending on later versions, becomes intolerable and the system seeks a solution. The solutions are different, but the pattern is similar. A disturbance arises, authority responds, the world is reorganized. This is how Mesopotamian narrative often works. It is not linear history, it is structural explanation. And the flood tablet from Nippur adds something crucial: a pre-flood world. It speaks of antediluvian cities and their rulers, implying that civilization existed before catastrophe and that knowledge of that world was preserved afterward. This supports the philosophical framework we are exploring. If the Sumerians and Babylonians preserved lists of pre-flood cities and rulers, then they were imagining civilization not as a sudden beginning, but as a cycle: founding, flourishing, destruction, restoration. And restoration implies inheritance. A post-flood world inherits memory of what came before. So what if the Igigi rebellion belongs to the same kind of memory? Not necessarily as a literal chronicle, but as a remembered rupture in the order of things, preserved as a story because it explained why the world is the way it is. If humans exist to bear labour after the rebellion, then humans are an inheritance of divine crisis. If kingship descends and is interrupted by a flood, then kingship is also an inheritance of a broken timeline. Everything important becomes inherited rather than invented. Work is inherited, kingship is inherited, even knowledge is inherited, transmitted through tablets, through scribal schools, through temples that outlast dynasties. And this brings us back to the title phrase, Anunnaki War, because when you place rebellion and flood side by side, war begins to look less like a single conflict and more like a recurring pattern, systems breaking under strain, then being rebuilt through decree. We should be careful not to overreach. But we can allow the question: what if the Mesopotamian scribes were preserving an ancient philosophy that order is never permanent and that civilization is always a restoration after upheaval, whether that upheaval happens on earth or, in their stories, in heaven? If so, then the Igigi rebellion is not just a curiosity. It is one part of a larger archive of rupture, and that archive is what scribes guarded, which leads us naturally to the most overt scribal document of all, a list that begins with kingship descending from heaven, and that marks time with the simple, chilling statement that the flood swept over. Kingship descends, and then the flood sweeps over. There is a particular style of writing that feels almost like stone, even when it is pressed into clay. The King List, a document that is not simply a chronicle, not simply myth, not simply history. It is a frame, a way of organising the past into legitimacy. In the Sumerian King List, preserved in multiple manuscripts and studied through scholarly corpora, kingship begins as something that descends from heaven. It moves from city to city. It is treated like an office that can be transferred, like a torch carried across the land. And then there is the flood. The flood sweeps over. And after the flood has swept over, kingship descends from heaven again. That structure is astonishing. It implies that kingship is not only political, it is cosmic. It can be interrupted by catastrophe and then restored. So when we place the Igigi rebellion into this worldview, rebellion becomes easier to interpret, because this is a culture that thought in terms of disrupted order. Order can be given, order can be lost, order can return, and the return of order does not begin with invention. It begins with descent, with restoration, with inheritance. A king does not create kingship, a king receives it. A city does not invent its status. A city becomes the seat of kingship for a time, then loses it. In that sense, Mesopotamian civilization describes itself as a series of restorations. So what if the Igigi rebellion is another kind of restoration story? Not about kingship, but about labour. In Atra-Hasis, labour shifts from gods to humans. In the king list, kingship shifts from heaven to earth through cities. Both are transfers, both are inheritances, both tell us that the human world is shaped by decisions made in a realm above human control. And if Enlil stands at the centre of that realm as a decreeing power, then rebellion against Enlil becomes a mythic way of speaking about resistance to the system that assigns burdens. The king list also teaches us something about memory. It is selective, it compresses, it shapes time into meaning. It does not merely tell you what happened, it tells you what should be remembered. So when a tradition like Atra-Hasis preserves the theme of rebellion, we can ask, what is it teaching the listener to remember? Perhaps it teaches that labour is foundational and must be assigned. Perhaps it teaches that rebellion is a threat that forces reorganisation. Perhaps it teaches that the creation of humans was not a gift of leisure, but an administrative measure, an act of governance. And that is where the Anunnaki enter again. In many interpretations, the Anunnaki are the gods who decree, who decide, who hold authority in assembly. The Igigi, by contrast, represent a group that bears burdens, at least in the Atra-Hasis framing. When that burden becomes intolerable, the system must change. The king list is not about gods working, but it is about authority moving, and that movement mirrors the cosmic movement in Atra-Hasis. Burdens shift downward. In both cases, what is above imposes structure on what is below. This is one reason the Mesopotamian record can feel unsettling. It does not flatter humans. It situates humans within hierarchy. Yet it also offers a form of dignity. Humans are part of a cosmic order. Humans are necessary. Humans are the ones who carry the world forward. If knowledge is inherited, then humans are inheritors of responsibility. And if the Igigi rebellion led to human creation, then humans inherit the aftermath of divine conflict. Not as victims necessarily, but as participants in restoration, as the ones who rebuild, which is perhaps why these texts were so carefully copied, because to live in Mesopotamia was to live in a landscape where stability was never guaranteed, where floods and droughts and invasions could erase a city's prosperity within a generation. In such a world, the idea that civilization is restoration rather than invention might feel like comfort. It means that what was lost can return, that order can be re-established, that the past contains instructions, and the tablets themselves become those instructions. They are literal preserved memory, pressed into clay, carried through fire and collapse, stored in archives, recovered in modern times. If you want to understand why the Igigi rebellion remains compelling, you have to understand that it sits inside this broader habit of thought, the habit of explaining the world through inherited decrees and remembered ruptures, which leads us to the place where thousands of tablets, flood stories, myths, omens, prayers were buried under rubble, waiting for a foreman's shovel to strike them. The library under the dust at Kyunjik, the the library under the dust at Kyunjik. Imagine the sound first. Not a dramatic sound, not a soundtrack, just the small dry scrape of metal against soil, the shifting of rubble, the muffled crumble of ancient brick, and then clay. Not a single tablet sitting upright like a treasure, but fragments scattered, mixed with the debris of collapsed rooms. In the mid-19th century, excavations at Kyunjik, ancient Nineveh, began to reveal what we now call the Library of Ashurbanipal, though it is better understood as a royal collection of texts, thousands of tablets and fragments, spanning literature, scholarship, ritual, and administration. Accounts of those excavations describe rooms filled with tablets to a surprising depth, tablets of different sizes, some large and flat, others small and curved, their cuneiform characters sometimes so minute they could be hard to read without magnification. This matters because much of what modern audiences think of as Mesopotamian mythology comes through this kind of find. A library assembled centuries after the earliest Sumerian city-states, preserving older traditions in later copies. So when we read the flood story in a first millennium form, or when we encounter terms like Igigi in later corpora, we are often encountering a curated memory, text selected, copied, and stored as part of a scholarly tradition. In that sense, the library is not just a find spot. It is an ancient act of preservation, a deliberate attempt to gather and keep knowledge. And that aligns with our core philosophical framework. What if the Mesopotamians saw themselves as preservers? If Ashurbanipal's scribes gathered these tablets, they were not inventing the traditions. They were inheriting them, copying them, restoring them into a new archive. They were doing, at a royal scale, what the Atra-Hasis story implies at a cosmic scale, carrying burdens forward so order and knowledge do not vanish. The modern story of discovery is complicated, shaped by imperial context and by the loss of many archaeological records. But the essential point remains. Thousands of tablets were recovered from Nineveh, and among them were texts that preserved Mesopotamian views of creation, flood, divine governance, and the fragile boundary between order and chaos. One of the most famous is a fragment known in the British Museum as K3375, often called the Flood Tablet, associated with Tablet C of the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is where, in modern imagination, the flood story becomes vivid. The warning, the boat, the animals, the storm, the sacrifice. But in our investigation, the flood is not the focus for its own sake. It is evidence of transmission, because the flood motif appears in earlier Sumerian form, in Old Babylonian forms, and in later canonical forms. The same core story travels through time, changing shape. And if flood narratives can be transmitted and reshaped, then so can rebellion narratives. The library at Kyunjik reminds us of this. What we have is not a single original voice. It is a tradition, layered. So when we say Sumerian texts reveal, we must remember that sometimes what we call Sumerian comes to us through Akkadian scribes, through later libraries, through curated collections. The Igigi term itself is associated with Akkadian contexts, even if later scribes and scholars discuss possible logographic equivalents. That does not weaken the story, it deepens it. It shows us a civilization, actually a succession of civilizations, preserving and transmitting the same questions. Why do we work? Why does authority decree burdens? What happens when those burdened refuse? How is order restored? These are not just ancient questions, they are structural questions of any complex society. But we must not make modern analogies. We must keep the questions inside the ancient framework. Inside the ancient framework, rebellion is cosmic and restoration is sacred, and the library at Kyunjik, buried under rubble, is like the physical embodiment of that idea, knowledge preserved through collapse. A shattered archive that still speaks. And now, with that archive in mind, we can approach the flood tablet itself not as a side story, but as a mirror that shows how motifs survive, how divine decisions are framed, and how later scribes preserved earlier memories in canonical form. But another text complicates the picture further, because it shows us the same flood motif not in the language of heroism, but in the language of decrees and consequences, like a record of policy in the heavens. And that is where we go next. The flood tablet reframed for a later world. When you stand before a cuneiform tablet like K3375, you are not just looking at writing, you are looking at compression, a story reduced into wedges, a voice reduced into marks, a tradition reduced into an object. The British Museum identifies K3375 as the flood tablet, also known as the Gilgamesh tablet, part of the library of Ashurbanipal, a fragment of a clay tablet from the Neo-Assyrian period discovered at Koyunjik, the mound covering ancient Nineveh. This is one of those objects that changed how the modern world understood ancient literature, because when its content was first read in the 19th century, it was recognised as a flood story, and that recognition reverberated through scholarship and public imagination. But for us, its importance is more methodical. K3375 demonstrates that Mesopotamian traditions were copied and curated across centuries. A Neo-Assyrian tablet preserves a story whose roots extend deep into earlier periods. And because it is preserved in a royal library, it implies institutional preservation, scribes tasked with copying, editing, and maintaining knowledge. In other words, inheritance. This is essential to our core thesis. If the Mesopotamians preserved knowledge rather than purely inventing it, then canonical texts like Gilgamesh are not only literature, they are archives of older memory. So what does K3375 do for the Igigi rebellion question? It reminds us that stories about divine decision-making and human fate were not isolated. The flood story is about divine decree. It is about a decision to destroy, a warning offered by one God, survival through obedience, restoration through sacrifice. Even in later form, the flood story preserves the sense that the gods govern the world through deliberation and decree, and that humans live inside the consequences. That is the same political atmosphere that surrounds the Igigi rebellion. In Atra-Hasis, the gods face a labour crisis. In flood narratives, the gods face a crisis of human proliferation or noise. In both, the response is systemic. So we can begin to see war not as a single episode, but as a recurring pattern of governance crisis, a moment when the existing arrangement produces intolerable strain and the divine order changes policy. Humans are created to relieve divine labour. Humans are culled to relieve divine disturbance. These are harsh solutions, but they fit the logic of the texts. The world must be stabilised, and stabilisation requires decisive action. Mainstream scholarship tends to interpret these as mythic explanations reflecting human realities, labour burdens, social strain, ecological pressures, the fragility of irrigation societies, the anxieties of city life. That interpretation is strong and grounded. But there is still an overlooked detail that matters for our title. The stories treat these crises as if they happened before, not as if they are imagined possibilities, but as if they are remembered events in the structure of the world. And this is where our speculative question can be held gently. What if the Mesopotamians preserved these stories because they believed they were inherited memories, accounts of primordial restructuring encoded into myth so they could survive? In that view, K3375 is not just a literary artefact. It is a witness to preservation, the act of carrying a memory across time. A Neo-Assyrian fragment becomes a vessel for an older story. And if a flood memory can be carried that far, then a rebellion memory can be carried too. But we must remain disciplined. K3375 does not directly describe the Igigi rebellion. It is part of a later flood tradition. Its role in our investigation is to establish the reality of transmission and the habit of preserving divine governance narratives in institutional archives. It tells us that the Mesopotamians did not discard their old questions, they collected them, and it raises another question, quiet and inevitable. If a royal library collected tablets about floods and decrees, Did it also collect tablets about rebellion and labour? And if so, what did those texts look like in later form? How did the concept of the Igigi evolve over time? How did divine assembly politics become formalised in later myths? And what does that tell us about the meaning of rebellion in the Mesopotamian mind? The pattern extends, but it shifts, because later canonical texts sometimes treat divine conflict less like a labour dispute and more like an assembly decision, a contest of authority, a negotiation of rank. And in that shift, war becomes less about physical confrontation and more about the structure of decree. That brings us to Enma-Eli traditions and the politics of the divine assembly, where names like Igigi appear again, not always in the same role, but in the same atmosphere of hierarchy. And that is where our next chapter waits, like a room in a buried palace, filled with fragments that still carry the sound of ancient decisions, Enma-Eli fragments, and the politics of the divine assembly. If the Igigi rebellion begins as a story of labour, then later Mesopotamian tradition teaches us how labour becomes law. In the older framing, the strain is physical, the work is heavy, the distress is much. The ones who bear it reach a breaking point, and the system is forced to change. But as centuries pass, as scribal schools refine their language, as raw libraries collect and classify texts, the same kind of tension often appears in a different costume. Less like a work gang refusing its tools, more like an assembly reordering rank, less like a shout in the dark, more like a decree spoken out loud and written down afterward. This is one reason we must move carefully when we use the word war. In these tablets, conflict is not always depicted as blades and blood. It is often depicted as a dispute over who decrees, who carries, who is elevated, who is diminished, who is permitted to rest. So when we enter the world of the Enma-Eli tradition, we step into a mythology that is deeply concerned with hierarchy, with enthronement, with the establishment of cosmic order through authority. Here the younger gods are not simply workers, they are also political actors within an assembly. They appear in scenes of gathering, acclaim, fear, and ascent. And the name Igigi continues to appear in these later contexts as part of that divine population, an upper world collective whose membership is not fixed, whose role shifts across time, but whose presence signals that the gods themselves can be arranged, ranked, and reorganized. To understand how this connects back to the Igigi rebellion against Enlil, imagine the divine world as an institution that must constantly keep itself functioning. In one memory, the institution suffers from labour overload. In another memory, it suffers from threat and chaos. In both, the solution is administrative. The system produces a new structure that stabilises it. This is the pattern our title invites us to notice. Because if the Sumerians and their successors were preservers of knowledge, then what they preserved may include not only stories of floods and monsters, but stories of how authority survives internal fracture. And Enlil remains central to this question, because Enlil represents a kind of authority that is older than any one city-state, a power associated with decree, with the ordering wind, with the maintenance of boundaries. So when later myths show divine assemblies and reorganised rank, we can ask, quietly, whether they are preserving an echo of the same old tension. Authority cannot demand endlessly without consequence. Mainstream interpretation would say these are mythic dramatizations of cosmic order, used in ritual and ideology, reflecting political realities of kingship and empire. That is fair. But the problems with that mainstream view are not that it is wrong. The problem is that it can sometimes smooth the story too much, making the divine world appear more coherent than the texts themselves allow. Because even in later canonical myth, the gods argue, they fear, they seek support, they convene assemblies, they elevate one figure among them, they negotiate the right to decree. And negotiation implies that power is not absolute. Which returns us to the rebellion motif. If the Igigi rebellion is one narrative of refusal, then the assembly politics of later myth is another narrative of refusal transformed, refusal channeled into procedure, into vote, into acclamation, into law. It is as if the raw disturbance of the older story becomes, over centuries, a formalized memory. Yes, conflict happened, but conflict was absorbed into governance. And that is one way civilizations survive. They turn violence into ritual. They turn disruption into institution. They take what could destroy them and they fold it into order. This is not a modern observation. It is the internal logic of the Mesopotamian texts, because the texts rarely celebrate chaos. They describe chaos so that order can be justified. So if your title speaks of an Anunnaki war, one possible reading is that the war is the ongoing struggle to maintain order against the forces that unmake it, whether those forces come from outside, like flood and storm, or from within, like labour refusal and dissent. And notice what happens when we place Enlil into this picture. Enlil again and again is the one associated with limits. Limits on labour, limits on noise, limits on what humans may do, and how long humans may last. In such a role, Enlil becomes the face of constraint, and constraint always invites resistance, whether expressed as rebellion or as negotiation. So perhaps the story of rebellion against Enlil is not a one-time episode. Perhaps it is a mythic way of naming the permanent tension between decree and endurance, between the one who commands and the ones who carry, between the architecture of a system and the living bodies inside it. If this is beginning to feel abstract, let's return to something more physical. A fragment of clay recovered from a palace mound tells us not only what the story is, but how the story survived. In the case of Enlil fragments, the tablets are often small, broken, partial, evidence of a text that existed in full, then shattered, then was pieced together by scholars from scattered witnesses. That physical fragmentation is a reminder. The ancient world did not hand down a perfect book. It handed down broken clay. So our interpretation must also be broken, held with humility, aware that we see only parts. And yet even in parts, patterns appear. Labour crisis, authority response, reorganisation, inheritance. This pattern extends beyond Enlil, beyond Atra-Hasis, beyond any one composition. It is the pattern of Mesopotamian memory itself. Civilization is the act of keeping order alive after rupture, which leads us back to the question we cannot avoid. What makes a rebellion a rebellion? Because until we define that, we cannot responsibly speak of the Igigi as rebels, or Enlil as the one they rebel against. And the most careful definition is not dramatic at all. A rebellion in these texts is a refusal that forces an administrative solution. And that is where we go next. What makes a rebellion a rebellion? A rebellion is not merely anger. A rebellion is not merely complaint. A rebellion is the moment when a system stops functioning because those who sustain it refuse to continue. In the Atra-Hasis tradition, the system is divine labour. The burden is too great. The distress is much. The ones bearing the work will not bear it any longer. That is the mechanical heart of the rebellion. The machine of the cosmos stalls. And then something remarkable happens. The Anunnaki must find a solution. This is a small sentence with enormous implications, because it means authority is constrained. Even if the Anunnaki are the great gods, even if Enlil stands as a decreeing power, they cannot simply command the universe into compliance without consequence. Their command has produced a breaking point, so they must adapt, they must restructure. And the outcome, as the tradition is commonly summarized, is that humans are created to bear the work from then on. In other words, the rebellion results in a transfer of burden. It is not just a story of conflict, it is a story of policy change. And that is why it mattered to scribes. Because scribes lived inside systems of policy change. They recorded taxation, labour obligations, temple offerings, legal disputes, royal decrees. They knew that societies are made of burdens distributed across people. And so the cosmic story becomes a mirror of social reality. Burdens are redistributed when a layer of society refuses, breaks, or collapses. Mainstream scholars treat this as mythic etiology, why humans work, why labour is part of the human condition, why the gods are served. That is persuasive, but there is a detail that deserves special attention in a sleep-oriented investigative telling. The rebellion is not portrayed as a victory of freedom, it is portrayed as a transformation of burden. The Igigi stop bearing the work, but the work does not vanish. It moves, it descends, and that descent is, in a way, the origin of humanity's role. So if we treat the texts as records from the Sumerian and Babylonian perspective, then human beings are not the inventors of civilization in these narratives. Humans are the inheritors of an already existing civilizational task. They inherit canals, they inherit cities, they inherit temple maintenance, they inherit a world that already has structure. In this framework, civilization is not a sudden spark. Civilization is assignment. That is a profound difference. It suggests that the Mesopotamians imagined order as older than human beings. And if order is older than humans, then order must come from elsewhere, whether understood as divine decree, cosmic law, or inherited memory. This is where the Anunnaki question becomes naturally ambiguous, in the precise way your prompt requires. The texts treat them as gods, yet the texts also describe them like administrators, decreeing, assigning, convening, solving problems. We do not need to conclude anything beyond that. We can simply observe the divine world behaves like an institution, and institutions produce burdens. Institutions face resistance. Institutions respond by reorganizing. So, what if the Anunnaki war in your title is not a war of annihilation, but a war of governance? A war fought through decisions and consequences rather than weapons. A war whose outcome is the creation or appointment of human labour. That reading does not require aliens, and it does not require cynicism. It simply requires us to listen to the structure of the myth, because myths often preserve the shape of something real, even when their surface details are symbolic. And if that is true, then the Igigi rebellion may preserve the shape of a genuine social memory, an ancient recognition that labour systems can collapse, and when they collapse, burdens are shifted downward. This is uncomfortable, but it is also consistent with the world these texts came from, a world where survival depended on coordinated labour, and where those who managed labour, temples, palaces, needed stories that justified why work must continue even if it is heavy. And that brings Enlil back into focus, because if Enlil represents the decree that maintains order, then Enlil also represents the decree that maintains burden. To rebel against Enlil is in effect to rebel against the necessity of carrying the system. But the system cannot be allowed to fail. So the solution is not to remove work. The solution is to create a new bearer of work, humans. And once humans enter the picture, the rest of Mesopotamian civilization, kingship, temples, law, becomes in the text a continuation of that arrangement. Humans work, humans build, humans offer sacrifice, humans sustain the city gods. This is not invention, it is inheritance. And if you hold that thought gently, you can feel why these stories are so persistent. They explain not only why humans work, but why humans cannot simply stop working. Because if humans stop, the whole inherited order collapses, just as the divine order nearly collapsed when the Igigi refused. And now, with that structural understanding in place, we can approach Enlil from a new angle, not as a character with moods, but as a role that must keep the system stable. Enlil as office, not personality. When modern audiences hear ancient names, we tend to picture personalities, faces, tempers, dramas. But in Mesopotamian thought, a god is often more than a person. A god is a domain. A god is an office. A god is a set of functions carried by a name. So Enlil is not only someone, Enlil is also something. Enlil is the authority of decree, the wind that separates, the power that makes boundaries real, the force that turns a chaotic landscape into a governed world. When the stories place Enlil at the centre of decisions, whether those decisions concern labour burdens or flood decrees, they are not merely telling you what Enlil wanted, they are telling you how order behaves. And order, in Mesopotamian thought, is not gentle. Order is necessary. Order requires limits. Order requires someone or something to enforce those limits. That is Enlil's role in many traditions. So when the Igigi rebel against Enlil, we can frame it as rebellion against a personality, but we can also frame it as rebellion against the role of constraint itself, against the fact that someone must say, this is your task. This is important, because it allows us to hold the story's ambiguity without forcing it into a simplistic drama of good versus evil. The texts do not portray Enlil as a cartoon villain. They portray Enlil as the one who must keep the world functioning. And the ones who rebel are not portrayed as pure heroes. They are portrayed as burdened beings who have reached the end of endurance. So the war becomes, again, a structural conflict. Authority must maintain order, labour must sustain order, labour reaches a breaking point, authority must restructure order. This is not melodrama, this is systems thinking, rendered in myth. And now, with Enlil understood as an office-like presence, we can reconsider the title's promise. Sumerian texts reveal. They reveal, perhaps, that the earliest remembered conflicts were not about territory, but about allocation. Who bears the burden? Who is exempt? Who decrees? Who obeys? Those are the questions that shape every civilization, ancient or modern, but we will keep them inside the Mesopotamian frame. Inside that frame, the answer is burdens descend. The more powerful decree, the less powerful carry. And when the carriers refuse, the system invents a new layer to carry beneath them, humans. This can sound bleak, but the Mesopotamian record also offers a kind of dignity in it. Humans are not meaningless. Humans are essential. Humans are the ones through whom order continues. In a floodplain where cities can disappear into silt, the idea of being part of cosmic maintenance might have been a form of stability, a reason for rituals, a reason for kings, a reason for temples, a reason for law. So Enlil's role is not simply to oppress, it is to stabilise. And stabilisation is never free. It costs labour, it costs sacrifice, it costs the acceptance of burden, which is why rebellion, when it appears, is so threatening. It threatens the entire arrangement. And so the texts preserve rebellion not to celebrate it, but to explain how it was absorbed, how it was turned into a new policy, how it was answered with the creation of humans who inherit the work. Now, as we approach the end of this section of the journey, we need to slow down again and do something the ancient scribes did often. We need to lay out multiple interpretations and allow them to coexist, not as a recap, but as a careful choice of lenses. Because the same evidence can sustain more than one reading, and the most honest documentary voice does not force the listener into a single conclusion. It shows the artifacts, it shows the patterns, and then it leaves the final judgment resting gently in the listener's hands. That is what we will do next, in a quiet room of 3 readings. 3 readings in the quiet room of the tablets. There is a particular stillness that comes when you stop trying to solve an ancient story, and instead let it sit in its own shape. The Igigi rebellion against Enlil is one of those stories. It resists a single interpretation, not because it is meaningless, but because it was preserved across time by people with different needs, scribes, priests, kings, scholars. So let us hold 3 readings side by side, like 3 clay fragments laid out on a table, each one real, each one incomplete, each one offering a different angle. The first reading is the mainstream one. The rebellion is mythic explanation. The story begins with divine labour because it wants to explain human labour. The Igigi refuse because the story requires a crisis that justifies change. Humans are created because humans exist, and the text is giving an origin for that reality. Under this reading, the rebellion is narrative logic, an etiological mechanism. It reflects human realities of labour obligations and social hierarchy, but it is not a historical memory, it is a myth. This is a strong reading because it fits the function of myth in many cultures. The second reading is more subtle. The rebellion is encoded social memory. The story preserves the emotional truth of a labour system under strain, the sense of burden, distress, refusal, and reorganisation. It mirrors the core of labour systems of Mesopotamian states, where work could be imposed by authority and where the breaking of endurance could produce unrest. Under this reading, the gods are a mask for human society. The rebellion is not literal, but it preserves a memory of how people experienced forced labour and how rulers justified shifting burdens. This reading does not require the story to be true as an event. It requires it to be true as memory. The third reading is the one that your title invites, and it must be held with the most caution. The rebellion is a preserved account of an actual upheaval, remembered as divine, because it was beyond ordinary human scale. Under this reading, the Mesopotamians are not inventing from nothing, they are preserving. They are recording, in their own language, a memory of a pre-human or proto-human restructuring, an event so foundational that it became the explanation for why humans have their role. In this reading, the Anunnaki and Igigi are not symbols of classes, they are participants in a primordial order. Enlil is not merely a theological office, he is the face of the decreeing power within that order. And the rebellion is not metaphor, it is memory. Do we have proof? No. But we have reasons to entertain the possibility without surrendering to it. We have the persistent Mesopotamian habit of placing origins before the flood and of imagining civilization as restoration. We have the repeated motif of burdens transferred from above to below. We have the preservation of these texts across centuries in institutions dedicated to keeping knowledge. And we have the sense, built into the writing itself, that these are not invented as entertainment, but preserved as explanation. If you accept none of these readings fully, that is fine. The point is not to decide quickly. The point is to notice what all three readings share. They all agree that the story is about burden and authority. They all agree that the story ends not with chaos, but with a new arrangement. They all agree that humans become the inheritors of work. So, even without certainty, the pattern remains. And if you are listening for sleep, this is where the story can become strangely calming, because it suggests that the ancient scribes saw life as part of a long continuity, burdens carried forward, order restored, knowledge preserved. Even when the world breaks, something is kept. A tablet survives, a story survives, a name survives. And that survival is itself the quietest kind of victory. In the next stage of the journey, we will move from interpretation to implication, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that forces belief, but in a careful way that asks, if the preservation reading has any merit at all, what would it change about how we see the Sumerians? Would it mean that their greatest achievement was not invention, but remembering? Would it mean that what we call civilization is, in their own thought, a restoration of something older? And if so, then the Igigi rebellion is not merely a mythic scene. It is a doorway into how Mesopotamia understood the inheritance of knowledge. And that question, who they were preserving it for, opens into the final stretch of our story, where the vault door closes softly and the tablet returns to silence. Sumplarks, supplar, supplark sucks. If the Sumerians preserved knowledge, who were they preserving it for? There is a way to listen to these stories that changes them. Instead of treating them as inventions, you treat them as inheritances. You treat a tablet not as the first time something was imagined, but as the latest time something was remembered. And then the question becomes almost unavoidable. If the scribes of Mesopotamia preserved the story of the Igigi, preserved the memory of burden, of refusal, of a solution found under pressure, who were they preserving it for? Because a story like this does not flatter the listener. It tells you that you exist to bear work. It tells you that the world's order was arranged before you arrived. It tells you that authority, when it is disturbed, responds by redistributing burden. So why copy it? Why teach it? Why press it again into clay in neat wedge marks, as if the world depended on that memory remaining available? One answer is practical. A society built on irrigation and labour needs an explanation for why labour is sacred. Canals do not dig themselves. Fields do not water themselves. Walls do not rise unless many hands lift mud brick in rhythm. In such a place, a myth that turns work into cosmic necessity is not simply literature, it is social glue. It binds people to the idea that their effort is not random suffering, but participation in the maintenance of order. But there is another answer, quieter, and perhaps closer to the strange gravity of your title. What if the scribes preserved the Igigi rebellion because they believed it was part of the deep history of the world? Not history as we would write it today, with dates and maps and footnotes, but history as they understood it, a chain of remembered upheavals that explained why things are arranged as they are. In that worldview, the rebellion is not entertainment, it is origin, and origins are not optional to preserve. Origins are the foundation stones of meaning. That is why the Mesopotamian record is filled with beginnings, beginnings of kingship, beginnings of cities, beginnings of work, beginnings of the flood, beginnings of decrees. And when you place the Igigi rebellion among these beginnings, it begins to look like one more hinge event, one more turning point that separates a before from an after. Before the rebellion, divine beings bore the work. After the rebellion, humans bore the work. That is not a small change. That is the creation of the human condition as Mesopotamia framed it. And now notice how this aligns with another Mesopotamian obsession, the division of time by catastrophe. The flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, kingship descended from heaven. Even when the details vary from text to text, the structure remains, a rupture, then a restoration. So if you hold the rebellion in the same structural frame, you can feel its function. It is a rupture in heaven, and the restoration is humanity. This is why the title Anunnaki War can be approached without turning it into spectacle. If the conflict is about burden and authority, then the war is the struggle to maintain order when the system's lower layer refuses. And the outcome, humans created to bear the burden, becomes the most consequential peace treaty imaginable, a settlement written into the fabric of human life. But there is a tension that remains, and it matters. Because if humans were created to replace the Igigi as labour bearers, then humans are, in a sense, the descendants of rebellion, not the descendants of victory, the descendants of compromise, the descendants of a system that could not hold together without inventing or appointing someone else to carry what others refused. That has implications for how we understand early civilization. It suggests that the Sumerians and their successors may have seen themselves as inheritors of an old burden, one not chosen but assigned. And in that view, cities are not triumphs of freedom. Cities are institutions of maintenance. Temples are not just houses of worship. Temples are administrative centres where the world's stability is managed through ritual, offering, and record. Kings are not merely strongmen. Kings are the human faces of a cosmic mandate, tasked with sustaining order so catastrophe does not return. This does not prove that the rebellion was historical. It suggests why the rebellion was remembered. Because a civilization that thinks in terms of inherited order will preserve the stories that define what was inherited. And that may be the deepest reason clay tablets exist at all. Not because humans love writing for its own sake, but because memory is fragile. And without memory, the restored world collapses back into noise and flood. If the Sumerians preserved knowledge, they were preserving it for the same reason their myths say humans exist, to keep the system from breaking again. And if that is true, then the Igigi rebellion is not simply a myth about gods. It is a myth about why memory must be carried, even when it is heavy, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it tells you that your role is not to invent, but to maintain. And this brings us back to the tablet in the museum, behind glass, holding its broken edge toward us like a quiet reminder. We are listening to an argument made thousands of years ago, an argument that says order must be preserved, and preservation always has a cost. It costs labour, it costs obedience, it costs sacrifice, it costs the willingness to carry what came before. If you let that idea settle gently, it begins to explain the mood of Mesopotamian civilization itself, a mood that is not optimistic in the modern sense, but is deeply committed to continuity, a mood that assumes collapse is always possible, a mood that treats the past not as dead, but as a set of instructions. And now, with that mood in mind, we can move into the final return, not toward a shouted conclusion, but toward the same calm place we started. A tablet, a fragment, a story pressed into clay, and a quiet closing thought, like a lamp being turned down. The vault door closes softly. Return, in your mind, to the tablet, not to the myth in your mind, but to the object itself. A piece of clay once soft enough to receive the pressure of a reed stylus. A piece of clay later baked hard enough to survive fire, collapse and burial. A piece of clay broken, incomplete, and yet still legible enough that we can feel a story through it. It is difficult to hold an ancient tablet without feeling time in your hands. Not time as a concept, time as weight, time as distance. Time as the quiet fact that people lived, worked, argued, feared floods, built walls, worshipped, and then disappeared, while their writing remained. When you look at the wedge marks, you are not only looking at language, you are looking at discipline. A scribe learnt those marks through repetition, through correction, through years of practice. And when that scribe copied an old story, whether about the Igigi, or the flood, or kingship descending from heaven, he was performing a kind of obedience. Obedience to tradition, obedience to memory, obedience to the idea that what came before must not be lost. That is the heart of the Mesopotamian archive. It is not simply a collection of myths, it is a technology of continuity. So what does the Igigi rebellion become in that frame? It becomes less like a sensational tale and more like a preserved pressure point, a remembered moment when a burden became unbearable, a remembered moment when authority was forced to respond, a remembered moment when the world's arrangement changed. If you read it as myth, it explains why humans work. If you read it as social memory, it preserves the shape of labour and hierarchy. If you read it as deep historical memory, it suggests that the Sumerians thought civilization itself was an inherited restoration after an upheaval beyond ordinary time. None of these readings needs to cancel the others. The tablets do not demand a single interpretation. They demand patience. They demand that we hold ambiguity the way we hold a fragile object, careful not to crush it with certainty. And perhaps that is the most sleep-friendly truth in this whole investigation. We do not have to solve it tonight. We only have to sit with it. Because the value of these ancient texts is not that they give us a final answer. The value is that they reveal how ancient people framed existence. They framed existence as maintenance, as burden carried forward, as order restored again and again, as knowledge preserved so that the next generation could find its place inside the same vast structure. So when your title says Sumerian texts reveal the Igigi rebellion against Enlil, we can allow the promise to remain open rather than forcing it into a conclusion. The texts reveal a pattern of strain and response, a pattern of hierarchy and refusal, a pattern of solutions that descend downward, turning gods into administrators and humans into inheritors. And the name Enlil, hovering over all of it, becomes the name of constraint, the office of decree that makes order possible and also makes rebellion inevitable. In the end, we return to the simplest image, a small tablet, a quiet gallery, a story that survived because someone thought it mattered. If you are listening late, if the room is dark, if your breathing has slowed, you can let the story settle into the same silence it came from. Clay does not speak loudly. Clay does not hurry. Clay waits. And the tablets, in their own way, ask us to do the same, to wait, to listen, to remember that history is not only about what happened, it is also about what people chose to preserve. And what they chose to preserve again and again is the idea that civilization is not a sudden invention. Civilization is restoration, a careful rebuilding after rupture, a burden carried forward, a world kept from breaking again. So let the last thought be gentle. If the Igigi once refused to carry the work, and humans were created to carry it instead, then every act of building, every act of maintaining, every act of keeping something alive in a fragile world is part of that old story. Not as proof, as possibility, as a pattern. And the pattern is quiet enough now to let you sleep. If this story resonated with you, you can leave a note where you're listening from and what time it is there, and then you can let the tablet return to its shelf, the vault door close softly, and the ancient argument fade back into clay and darkness. K3375 and the flood reframed for a later world. There is a rhythm to how knowledge survives. It does not survive because it is written once, perfectly, and then locked away untouched. It survives because it is copied, and in the act of copying, something subtle happens. The scribe makes choices. A word is updated to match the dialect of a new city. A line is clarified because the old phrasing has become obscure. A passage is expanded because the patron wants emphasis. A section is condensed because space on the tablet is limited, and so the story changes even as it remains the same. This is the reality we face when we approach K3375, the fragment known as the Flood Tablet, housed now in the British Museum, recovered from the ruins of Nineveh, part of the great library assembled under Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BC. This is a Neo-Assyrian tablet. That means it was written more than 1,000 years after the earliest Sumerian city-states flourished, more than 1,000 years after the old Babylonian scribes pressed their versions of Atra-Hasis into clay at Sippar. And yet, when 19th century scholars first read K3375, they recognised immediately that it was preserving an older story, a flood narrative that echoed traditions found in fragments from much earlier periods. The flood itself is not our focus tonight. What matters for the Igigi investigation is what K3375 teaches us about transmission. Because if a flood story can travel across more than a millennium, reshaped but recognisable, then so can a rebellion story. And if later scribes chose to preserve these narratives in royal libraries, that tells us something about value. These were not disposable tales. These were texts considered essential to understanding the world. So let us move carefully through what K3375 implies. First, it confirms that Mesopotamian tradition was cumulative. Scribes did not discard older versions when they composed newer ones. They built upon them. They referenced them. They sometimes copied them side by side, creating what modern scholars call canonical and non-canonical versions, texts that became standard and texts that remained alternative. In that environment, the Igigi rebellion did not need to be retold in exactly the same way every time for its core structure to persist. The memory could shift shape. It could become more formal, more ritualized, more embedded in the language of divine assembly rather than divine labour. And that is exactly what we see when we trace how terms like Igigi and Anunnaki appear across time. In earlier contexts, the Igigi are explicitly burdened with work. In later contexts, the Igigi often appear as part of the assembled divine host, still differentiated from the Anunnaki, still associated with the upper realm, but no longer always depicted in the act of digging canals or carrying loads. Does that mean the rebellion was forgotten? No. It means the rebellion was absorbed into a broader framework of cosmic order. The disturbance became part of the background. The solution, humanity bearing the work, became so naturalized that the crisis that produced it could be spoken of more quietly, more indirectly. This is what happens when a society lives with a story for centuries. The edges soften, the urgency fades, but the structure remains. And K3375 shows us that structure in its mature form. It shows us a world where divine decisions are treated as established fact, where the flood is presented not as a surprise, but as a known chapter in cosmic history, where survival depends on obedience to divine instruction. That same atmosphere, divine decree, human consequence, survival through compliance, pervades the rebellion tradition. So when we speak of an Anunnaki war, we can now see how that phrase might evolve across time. In the earliest layer, it is raw, burden, refusal, confrontation. In the middle layer, it is administrative, a problem identified, a solution implemented. In the later layer, it is canonical, a truth so established that it no longer needs to be argued, only preserved. And K3375, as a product of that later layer, becomes evidence not of invention but of curation. The scribes of Ashurbanipal's library were not making up stories. They were assembling an archive of inherited wisdom. They were gathering texts that their civilization considered foundational. And among those texts were stories of divine conflict, flood, creation, and the assignment of human labour. That is not accidental. It is a statement of priority. It tells us what the Mesopotamians thought mattered, the origins of order, the maintenance of boundaries, the reasons for human existence, the fragility of stability. If you are listening in the dark, this is where you can let the weight of that priority settle, because the ancient world did not have printing presses. Every tablet was hand-copied, every line was a choice. And the fact that these stories were chosen again and again across centuries suggests they carried a truth the scribes believed should not be lost. Whether that truth is mythic, social, or historical, we can hold that question open. But the fact of preservation is not in question. K3375 survived. The Atra-Hasis fragments survived. The king lists survived. The creation epics survived. They survived because someone thought they should. And now, thousands of years later, we inherit the same question they faced. What do we do with this memory? Do we dismiss it as primitive fiction? Do we analyse it as cultural artefact? Or do we allow it to speak, however ambiguously, about how a civilization understood its own origins? The most disciplined answer is all three held at once. K3375 is fiction in the sense that it is narrative shaped by literary convention. K3375 is artifact in the sense that it reflects the society that produced it. And K3375 is memory in the sense that it claims to preserve something older than itself. That is the tension at the heart of ancient texts. They are all three things at once, and we do not have to choose one lens and discard the others. We can hold them the way a scribe holds a stylus, lightly enough to move, firmly enough to make a mark. And the mark that K3375 makes in our investigation is this. By the time of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the Mesopotamian intellectual tradition had formalized its stories of divine governance into a library. That library included flood narratives, creation narratives, and, by implication and by scholarly reconstruction, narratives of divine labour and rebellion. The rebellion did not disappear. It became part of the canon. And canon is what a civilization builds when it wants to ensure that the next generation knows what the previous generation knew. Canon is inheritance made systematic. So if the Igigi rebellion is part of that canon, then it is not a curious outlier. It is central. It is one of the memories the civilization could not afford to lose. And that brings us, at last, to the question of evolution. How did the divine assembly itself become formalized? How did terms like Igigi and Anunnaki shift from labour categories to cosmic roles? How did rebellion become procedure? And what does that tell us about the nature of authority in Mesopotamian thought? To answer that, we turn to the composition often called Enlil, the creation epic that shows us divine politics not as disruption but as establishment, not as chaos remembered but as order proclaimed. And in that shift we find the final layer of the archive, the moment when conflict becomes constitution, Enlil fragments, and the politics of the divine assembly. If the Igigi rebellion begins as a story of labour, then later Mesopotamian tradition teaches us how labour becomes law. In the older framing, the strain is physical, the work is heavy, the distress is much. The ones who bear it reach a breaking point, and the system is forced to change. But as centuries pass, as scribal schools refine their language, as royal libraries collect and classify texts, the same kind of tension often appears in a different costume, less like a work gang refusing its tools, more like an assembly reordering rank, less like a shout in the dark, more like a decree spoken out loud and written down afterward. This is one reason we must move carefully when we use the word war. In these tablets, conflict is not always depicted as blades and blood. It is often depicted as a dispute over who decrees, who carries, who is elevated, who is diminished, who is permitted to rest. So when we enter the world of the Enlil tradition, we step into a mythology that is deeply concerned with hierarchy, with enthronement, with the establishment of cosmic order through authority. Here, the younger gods are not simply workers, they are also political actors within an assembly. They appear in scenes of gathering, acclaim, fear, and ascent, and the name Igigi continues to appear in these later contexts as part of that divine population, an upper world collective whose membership is not fixed, whose role shifts across time, but whose presence signals that the gods themselves can be arranged, ranked, and reorganized. To understand how this connects back to the Igigi rebellion against Enlil, imagine the divine world as an institution that must constantly keep itself functioning. In one memory, the institution suffers from labour overload. In another memory, it suffers from threat and chaos. In both, the solution is administrative. The system produces a new structure that stabilizes it. This is the pattern our title invites us to notice. Because if the Sumerians and their successors were preservers of knowledge, then what they preserved may include not only stories of floods and monsters, but stories of how authority survives internal fracture. Enlil is often summarized as a creation epic centered on Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon, who rises to supremacy among the gods by defeating the primordial chaos represented by Tiamat. But beneath that narrative of cosmic battle is another story, a story about how authority is granted. Marduk does not simply seize power, he is chosen by the assembly. The gods convene, they face a crisis, they need a champion, and they offer Marduk kingship over the divine world in exchange for his willingness to confront Tiamat. This is assembly politics. This is negotiation. This is authority earned through service, then formalized through decree. And once Marduk defeats Tiamat, he does not rest. He organizes the cosmos. He assigns roles to the other gods. He creates humans, in some versions, from the blood of a defeated divine rebel to bear the service of the gods. Does this sound familiar? It should. Because the outcome is the same as in Atra-Hasis, humans are created to relieve divine burden. But the framing is different. In Atra-Hasis, the crisis is labour exhaustion among the Igigi. In Enlil, the crisis is cosmic threat, and the creation of humans is part of the reorganisation that follows victory. Yet both stories agree humans exist to serve, and both stories frame that service as part of a larger divine order. So what happens when we place these two traditions side by side? We we see that Mesopotamian thought could hold multiple origin stories at once, without insisting on a single authoritative version. The scribes were comfortable with plurality. They were comfortable with the idea that creation could be described from different angles, for different purposes, in different cities. But they were not comfortable with chaos. Every version ends with order established. Every version ends with roles assigned. Every version ends with authority legitimized. And in that sense, the Anunnaki war becomes less about a single battle and more about a recurring pattern. The divine world faces disruption, responds through assembly and decree, and restores stability by reorganizing the distribution of labour and authority. Now let us bring Enlil back into focus. In Enlil, Enlil is not the central figure. Marduk is. But Enlil still appears, and his role is telling. He is one of the senior gods, one of the assembly, one of those whose authority Marduk inherits or surpasses, depending on the version and the city that told it. In Babylonian tradition, Marduk's rise can be read as a theological elevation of Babylon itself, a way of saying that Babylon's god now holds the authority that older cities once claimed for their gods. But Enlil does not vanish. Enlil remains as a figure of decree, of boundary, of the older order, and that suggests something important for our investigation. The rebellion against Enlil, if it is preserved memory, may not be rebellion against a single deity. It may be rebellion against the older system of authority that Enlil represents, a system where labour is imposed from above, a system where the younger gods, or the subordinate gods, have no choice but to obey. And when that system breaks, a new arrangement emerges. Not one where authority disappears, but one where authority is renegotiated. Marduk's rise in Enlil is that renegotiation in narrative form. The assembly chooses him, he proves himself, he reorganizes the cosmos, and then he is acclaimed. This is not democracy, but it is also not tyranny. It is conditional authority, power granted in exchange for effective governance. And if that is how later Mesopotamian tradition frames divine kingship, then the Igigi rebellion fits as an earlier, rawer version of the same pattern. The Igigi refuse, the system breaks, authority must respond. A new arrangement is made, humans will carry the work, and that arrangement becomes the foundation of the world. In both stories, Atra-Hasis and Enlil, the endpoint is the same, humans bearing divine service. But the journey to that endpoint shows us how Mesopotamian thought evolved, from labour crisis to cosmic battle, from refusal to negotiation, from rebellion to assembly. The war becomes less physical and more procedural. And that is how a civilization matures its memory. It takes the rupture and turns it into ritual. It takes the conflict and turns it into law. It takes the rebellion and turns it into the reason why order must be maintained. Now, one more detail from Enlil deserves attention. In some versions, the text explicitly describes the Igigi as part of the divine host, who acclaim Marduk and participate in the cosmic order he establishes. They are no longer depicted as burdened labourers. They are depicted as members of the assembly. That shift is profound. It suggests that the Igigi won something, in a sense. They are no longer the ones who dig canals. They are part of the governing structure. But humans now occupy the role they once held. So the rebellion's outcome is not freedom for the Igigi, it is elevation. And the price of that elevation is the creation of a new subordinate class, humanity. This is not a comfortable reading, but it is consistent with the texts, and it raises a question that the ancient scribes may have been asking themselves. Is civilization a structure where burdens must always descend to some layer, where someone must always carry, where someone must always obey? If so, then the Igigi rebellion is not a story about liberation, it is a story about redistribution. And the Anunnaki war is not a battle for freedom, it is a struggle over who will bear the weight of the world. In Mesopotamian thought, that weight does not disappear, it only moves. And once it moves to humanity, the rest of history kingship, temples, cities, law becomes the structure that keeps humans carrying it. This is why the story matters, not because it is dramatic, but because it is structural. It reveals how a civilization thought about power, labour and obligation. And if we are willing to sit with that revelation without rushing to judgment, we can begin to see the ancient world not as primitive, but as deeply, uncomfortably clear-eyed. They knew that order requires labour. They knew that labour requires hierarchy. They knew that hierarchy produces strain. And they knew that strain, when it breaks, forces reorganisation. The Igigi rebellion is the mythic memory of that cycle, and Enlil is the formalisation of what comes after, a world where the cycle is controlled, ritualised, and made permanent through divine decree. So when we ask, what is the Anunnaki war? We can now answer, it is the war to establish who rules, who serves, and who carries. And the outcome of that war is the world the Mesopotamians lived in, and the world they preserved in clay so we would know it too. Which brings us to a question we cannot avoid any longer. If all of this is about labour, obligation, and the transfer of burden, then what exactly makes a rebellion a rebellion? Not in modern terms, but in the terms the texts themselves use. And that is where we must go next, into the technical, careful, almost bureaucratic question of what constitutes refusal in a system built on decree. What makes a rebellion a rebellion? A rebellion is not merely anger. A rebellion is not merely complaint. A rebellion is the moment when a system stops functioning because those who sustain it refuse to continue. In the Atra-Hasis tradition, the system is divine labour. The burden is too great. The distress is much. The ones bearing the work will not bear it any longer. That is the mechanical heart of the rebellion. The machine of the cosmos stalls. And then something remarkable happens. The Anunnaki must find a solution. This is a small sentence with enormous implications, because it means authority is constrained. Even if the Anunnaki are the great gods, even if Enlil stands as a decreeing power, they cannot simply command the universe into compliance without consequence. Their command has produced a breaking point, so they must adapt, they must restructure. And the outcome, as the tradition is commonly summarised, is that humans are created to bear the work from then on. In other words, the rebellion results in a transfer of burden. It is not just a story of conflict, it is a story of policy change, and that is why it mattered to scribes. Because scribes lived inside systems of policy change. They recorded taxation, labour obligations, temple offerings, legal disputes, royal decrees. They knew that societies are made of burdens distributed across people. And so the cosmic story becomes a mirror of social reality. Burdens are redistributed when a layer of society refuses, breaks, or collapses. Mainstream scholars treat this as mythic etiology, why humans work, why labour is part of the human condition, why the gods are served. That is persuasive. But there is a detail that deserves special attention in a sleep-oriented, investigative telling. The rebellion is not portrayed as a victory of freedom, it is portrayed as a transformation of burden. The Igigi stop bearing the work, but the work does not vanish. It moves, it descends. And that descent is in a way the origin of humanity's role. So if we treat the texts as records from the Sumerian and Babylonian perspective, then human beings are not the inventors of civilization in these narratives. Humans are the inheritors of an already existing civilizational task. They inherit canals, they inherit cities, they inherit temple maintenance, they inherit a world that already has structure. In this framework, civilization is not a sudden spark. Civilization is assignment. That is a profound difference. It suggests that the Mesopotamians imagined order as older than human beings. And if order is older than humans, then order must come from elsewhere, whether understood as divine decree, cosmic law, or inherited memory. This is where the Anunnaki question becomes naturally ambiguous. in the precise way your prompt requires. The texts treat them as gods, yet the texts also describe them like administrators, decreeing, assigning, convening, solving problems. We do not need to conclude anything beyond that. We can simply observe the divine world behaves like an institution, and institutions produce burdens. Institutions face resistance. Institutions respond by reorganizing. So what if the Anunnaki war in your title is not a war of annihilation, but a war of governance, a war fought through decisions and consequences rather than weapons, a war whose outcome is the creation or appointment of human labour? That reading does not require aliens, and it does not require cynicism. It simply requires us to listen to the structure of the myth, because myths often preserve the shape of something real, even when their surface details are symbolic. And if that is true, then the Igigi rebellion may preserve the shape of a genuine social memory, an ancient recognition that labour systems can collapse, and when they collapse, burdens are shifted downward. This is uncomfortable, but it is also consistent with the world these texts came from, a world where survival depended on coordinated labour, and where those who managed labour, temples, palaces, needed stories that justified why work must continue, even if it is heavy. Let us now become very precise about what the Atra-Hasis tradition describes as the mechanics of rebellion. The gods are said to be digging. They are dredging rivers and canals. They are doing this for a long time. Some versions specify 40 years, though numbers in mythology are often symbolic rather than literal. And then the text tells us they begin to complain. But complaint is not yet rebellion. Rebellion comes when they take collective action. In the most vivid reconstructed passages, assembled from fragments and scholarly additions, the Igigi are described as gathering, as surrounding Enlil's dwelling, as refusing to continue. This is not a spontaneous outburst. This is organised refusal. And organised refusal is what turns complaint into rebellion in any system, ancient or modern. One voice saying I cannot continue can be ignored or punished. Many voices saying we will not continue cannot be ignored. They force a response. So the rebellion is structurally a labour strike, and the fact that it is remembered in divine terms does not erase that structure. It may even preserve it more clearly, because divine narrative can speak truths about human society that direct historical record might suppress. Kings and temples might not write down accounts of actual labour strikes, but they might preserve a myth that encodes the fear of such an event and the necessity of preventing it by ensuring that burdens are distributed in a way that keeps the system functioning. In that sense, the creation of humans is not just a mythic event. It is a mythic solution to a systemic problem. How do you maintain order when the ones maintaining it refuse? You create or designate a new class to carry the burden. And once that new class exists, you build a civilization around the idea that their labour is necessary, sacred, and unchangeable. That is what temples do. That is what kingship does. That is what rituals do. They sanctify the arrangement so that it feels not like oppression, but like cosmic truth. Now, this does not mean the Mesopotamians were cynical. It means they were systematic. They understood that societies require labour, and that labour requires motivation. And one of the most powerful motivations is not reward, but meaning. If your work is part of maintaining the cosmos, then your suffering has purpose. If your work serves the gods, then your exhaustion is not in vain. If your work continues what was begun before you, then you are part of something larger than yourself. That is what the Igigi rebellion encodes. Not just a story of conflict, but a story of why human labour must continue despite its weight. And that brings us inevitably back to Enlil, because Enlil is the figure associated with the imposition of limits, the enforcement of decrees, the maintenance of boundaries. To rebel against Enlil is to rebel against the necessity of those limits. But the texts do not celebrate such rebellion. They contain it. They resolve it. they turn it into a new order, and that new order is the one humans inherit. So if we are asking what makes a rebellion in these texts, the answer is clear. A rebellion is when the structure of obligation breaks under its own weight, forcing authority to redesign the system. And the Igigi rebellion is the mythic record of that break and the redesign that followed, which means the Anunnaki war is not a war in the sense of invasion or conquest. It is a war in the sense of internal crisis, a war between the parts of a system that can no longer function together. And the resolution is not victory, it is reorganization. Humans are the outcome of that reorganization, and every canal dug, every brick laid, every offering made in a temple afterward is the continuation of the solution imposed after the rebellion. That is a heavy inheritance, but it is also, in the Mesopotamian view, a sacred one, because without that inheritance there would be no cities, no harvests, no continuity, no memory, only chaos and flood and the return of the primordial silence. And the scribes who copied these tablets believed that silence must be resisted, not through weapons, but through work, not through freedom, but through obligation, not through invention, but through preservation. And that belief is what kept the tablets alive century after century until we could find them again and ask the same old question: what does it mean to carry a world forward? The Mesopotamians had an answer, and their answer was written into the rebellion they chose to remember. Now, with that structure understood, we must turn to the figure at the centre of authority, not as a personality with moods, but as an office that must keep the system stable. Enlil, not as a god you might love or hate, but as a role that must be filled if the world is to continue. And that is where we go next. Chapter 11. Enlil as office, not personality. When modern audiences hear ancient names, we tend to picture personalities, faces, tempers, dramas. But in Mesopotamian thought, a god is often more than a person. A god is a domain. A god is an office. A god is a set of functions carried by a name. So Enlil is not only someone, Enlil is also something. Enlil is the authority of decree, the wind that separates, the power that makes boundaries real, the force that turns a chaotic landscape into a governed world. When the stories place Enlil at the centre of decisions, whether those decisions concern labour burdens or flood decrees, they are not merely telling you what Enlil wanted, they are telling you how order behaves. And order, in Mesopotamian thought, is not gentle. Order is necessary. Order requires limits. Order requires someone or something to enforce those limits. That is Enlil's role in many traditions. So when the Igigi rebel against Enlil, we can frame it as rebellion against a personality, but we can also frame it as rebellion against the role of constraint itself, against the fact that someone must say, this is your task, against the fact that someone must say, this far and no farther, against the fact that authority, by definition, draws lines that others may not cross. This is important because it allows us to hold the story's ambiguity without forcing it into a simplistic drama of good versus evil. The texts do not portray Enlil as a cartoon villain. They portray Enlil as the one who must keep the world functioning, and the ones who rebel are not portrayed as pure heroes. They are portrayed as burdened beings who have reached the end of endurance. So the war becomes again a structural conflict. Authority must maintain order. Labour must sustain order. Labour reaches a breaking point. Authority must restructure order. This is not melodrama. This is systems thinking rendered in myth. If you want to understand why Enlil appears so often in Mesopotamian literature as a figure of severity, you have to understand what severity means in this context. It does not mean cruelty for its own sake. It means the refusal to allow exceptions that would unravel the system. In a world where canals must be maintained or cities starve, where floodwaters must be managed or land is lost, where labour obligations must be met or the entire structure collapses, in such a world, the figure who enforces obligations cannot afford to be soft. Enlil represents that enforcement, not as a tyrant, but as the principle that order requires discipline, and discipline requires someone willing to say no. No, you cannot rest yet. No, the work is not finished. No, the burden cannot be lifted simply because it is heavy. This is why, in flood narratives, Enlil is often the one who decrees destruction when humanity becomes too numerous or too loud. It is not personal vendetta. It is the logic of constraint. The system has limits, and when those limits are exceeded, the system resets. That is a harsh logic, but it is the logic that runs beneath much of Mesopotamian thought. The world is not infinitely forgiving. The world has carrying capacity, and when that capacity is exceeded, catastrophe follows. So Enlil, as the office of constraint, becomes the voice that warns, do not exceed the limits. And when the limits are exceeded anyway, Enlil becomes the voice that decrees the consequences. In the Igigi rebellion, the limit that is exceeded is the capacity of the divine workforce to endure labour. Enlil, or the authority he represents, has imposed a burden that cannot be sustained, and when that burden breaks the ones carrying it, the system must change. But notice what does not happen. Enlil does not disappear. Authority does not vanish. Instead, authority adapts. A new solution is found. Humans will carry the burden, and once humans are created for that purpose, Enlil's role continues, now as the one who ensures humans fulfill their assigned task. This is why Enlil remains central across Mesopotamian tradition, even as cities rise and fall, even as patron deities shift, even as Marduk rises in Babylon and other gods rise elsewhere. Because Enlil is not merely a local deity. Enlil is the principle of cosmic governance. And governance, by its nature, is about maintaining systems even when individuals suffer. That is an uncomfortable truth. But the Mesopotamians did not shy away from uncomfortable truths. They encoded them into their myths, their rituals, their city planning, their legal codes. They built a civilization on the recognition that order is costly and that someone must pay the cost. In their mythology, the Igigi paid it first. Then humans inherited the payment. And the role of authority, Enlil's role, is to ensure the payment continues, so the world does not collapse back into chaos. Now here is where we must be very careful not to project modern values backward. In modern thought, we often assume that suffering is a sign of failure, and that a just system would minimize suffering. But Mesopotamian thought does not work that way. Suffering, in these texts, is often a sign of participation. To labour is to be part of the order. To refuse labour is to threaten the order. And to threaten the order is to invite catastrophe, flood, drought, invasion, collapse. So when the Igigi rebel, they are not celebrated for asserting their autonomy. They are contained, and their rebellion is resolved through a solution that preserves the system. That solution is the creation of humans. And once humans exist, the mythology teaches that human labour is not optional, it is cosmic necessity. This does not mean the Mesopotamians had no concept of justice or compassion. It means their concept of justice was structural rather than individual. Justice in this view is not about eliminating burden. Justice is about distributing burden in a way that keeps the system stable. And compassion is not about freeing people from work. Compassion is about ensuring that work has meaning, that it is honoured through ritual, that it is acknowledged as sacred service. That is what temples provided. That is what festivals provided. That is what kingship, at its best, was supposed to provide. The assurance that your labour was seen, valued, and part of something larger. So Enlil, as office, is not the enemy of humanity. Enlil is the custodian of the system that makes humanity possible. Without limits, there is no order. Without order, there is no civilization. Without civilization, there is only the silence before cities, the emptiness before names, the void before the first canal was dug. And the Mesopotamians chose order. They chose to carry the burden. They chose to preserve the memory of why that burden exists. And that choice is written into every line of their tablets, every brick of their ziggurats, every prayer offered in their temples. It is also written into the rebellion they preserve. Because the rebellion teaches the same lesson from the other side, if you refuse the burden, the system will replace you. That is not a threat. It is a description of how systems work. And the Mesopotamians were above all systematic. They thought in terms of structure, continuity, and inheritance. They thought in terms of offices that must be filled, roles that must be performed, work that must be done. And Enlil is the name they gave to the office that keeps all of it from falling apart. So when we ask why the Igigi rebelled against Enlil, we are really asking, why does labour rebel against constraint? And the answer is, because constraint, when it becomes unbearable, forces a crisis. But the crisis does not end constraint, it only reorganises it. Authority adapts, burden shifts, and the world continues under a new arrangement until the next breaking point. That is the cycle the texts describe. Not as tragedy and not as triumph, but as the permanent condition of civilized life. Work, strain, reorganization, preservation, over and over, pressed into clay, copied across centuries, carried through fire and flood and collapse until it reaches us. And now we inherit the same question the ancient scribes inherited. What do we do with this memory? Do we reject it as oppressive? Do we honour it as wisdom? Or do we hold it carefully, the way we hold a fragment of ancient clay, and ask what it meant to the people who thought it was worth preserving? That is the question we carry into the next stage, where we step back and hold 3 readings side by side, not to choose one, but to see what each reveals. Because the most honest scholarship is not about forcing certainty, it is about arranging possibilities with care and letting the evidence speak in its own quiet, broken voice. 3 readings in the quiet room of the tablets. There is a particular stillness that comes when you stop trying to solve an ancient story and instead let it sit in its own shape. The Igigi rebellion against Enlil is one of those stories. It resists a single interpretation, not because it is meaningless, but because it was preserved across time by people with different needs. Scribes, priests, kings, scholars. So let us hold 3 readings side by side, like 3 clay fragments laid out on a table, each one real, each one incomplete, each one offering a different angle, not to choose among them, but to see what each one illuminates. The first reading is the mainstream one. The rebellion is mythic explanation. The story begins with divine labour because it wants to explain human labour. The Igigi refuse because the story requires a crisis that justifies change. Humans are created because humans exist, and the text is giving an origin for that reality. Under this reading, the rebellion is narrative logic, an etiological mechanism. It reflects human realities of labour obligations and social hierarchy, but it is not a historical memory. It is a myth doing what myths do, explaining the present by constructing a dramatic past. This is a strong reading because it fits the function of myth in many cultures. Myths often serve to naturalise social arrangements by projecting them back into cosmic origins. If humans have always been meant to work, then questioning that arrangement becomes not just political dissent, but cosmic rebellion. The myth serves the stability of the system. It tells workers, this is your role, assigned before you were born, woven into the fabric of reality. And it tells rulers, your authority to command labour is not mere power, it is divine mandate, inherited from the gods themselves. This reading is respected in scholarship because it does not require us to believe the events literally happen. It allows us to analyse the text as a cultural product, reflecting and reinforcing the values of the society that produced it. The problems with this reading are not fatal, but they are worth noting. First, it can sometimes flatten the strangeness of the text. When we say it's just a myth explaining labour, we risk missing the emotional intensity of the story, the distress, the refusal, the confrontation. The text does not merely say humans were assigned to work, it says there was a crisis so severe that the cosmic order nearly broke. That is a different kind of claim. Second, this reading can underestimate the role of preservation. If the story is purely invented to justify labour, why preserve it across centuries, through different cities, through changing political regimes? Why copy it again and again? Myths that serve only immediate political purposes tend to fade when those purposes change. But the Igigi story persisted. That persistence suggests it carried something deeper, something that continued to resonate even as dynasties rose and fell. Still, the mainstream reading remains valuable. It keeps us grounded in the social reality of ancient Mesopotamia, where forced labour was real, where temple and palace economies depended on mobilizing human bodies, and where stories about divine burdens could serve to make human burdens feel inevitable. The second reading is more subtle. The rebellion is encoded social memory. The story preserves not a literal event, but the emotional and structural truth of a labour system under strain, the sense of burden, distress, refusal and reorganisation. It mirrors the core of labour systems of Mesopotamian states, where work could be imposed by authority, and where the breaking of endurance could produce unrest, whether that unrest led to migration, to passive resistance, to occasional uprisings, or simply to the quiet collapse of productivity. Under this reading, the gods are a mask for human society. The rebellion is not literal, but it preserves a memory, however transformed, of how people experienced forced labour and how rulers responded when labour systems failed. When the Igigi refused to dig canals, we might hear an echo of real labourers who fled work sites, or who died in such numbers that the work could not continue, or who simply wore down until the system had to change. When humans are created to replace them, we might hear an echo of how ruling classes always find new populations to exploit when old ones break, whether through conquest, enslavement, or the gradual absorption of tributary peoples. This reading does not require the story to be true as an event. It requires it to be true as memory, the kind of memory that is no longer factual but remains emotionally and structurally accurate. The shape of the experience survives, even if the details are transformed into mythic language. This reading is powerful because it honours the text's intensity without requiring us to accept its supernatural framing. It allows us to hear the voices of burdened people encoded within the voices of burdened gods. It treats the myth as a preserved cry, muffled by time and ritual, but still audible. The problems with this reading are also worth considering. It relies on inference. We do not have direct evidence of widespread labour revolts in early Mesopotamia, though we do have evidence of labour obligations, and we can reasonably assume they produced strain. But the leap from labour was hard to this myth preserves memory of labour revolt is not certain. It is plausible, but not provable. Second, this reading can sometimes reduce the myth to pure social allegory, losing sight of the fact that the people who wrote it believed in gods. They were not speaking in code, they were describing what they understood to be real events in a real divine world. Their metaphysics was different from ours, and if we translate everything they said into social commentary, we may miss something essential about how they thought. Still, the social memory reading remains compelling. It explains why the story feels so urgent, why it focuses on work and exhaustion, why it treats rebellion as crisis rather than adventure. It keeps the text connected to the real lives of people who dug canals, carried bricks, and maintained the infrastructure that made Mesopotamian civilization possible. The third reading is the one that your title invites, and it must be held with the most caution. The rebellion is a preserved account of an actual upheaval, remembered as divine, because it was beyond ordinary human scale. Under this reading, the Mesopotamians are not inventing from nothing. They are preserving. They are recording, in their own language and categories, a memory of a pre-human or proto-civilizational restructuring, an event so foundational that it became the explanation for why humans have their role. In this reading, the Anunnaki and Igigi are not symbols of classes, they are participants in a primordial order. Enlil is not merely a theological office, he is the face of the decreeing power within that order. And the rebellion is not metaphor, it is memory, distant, transformed, mythologized, but rooted in something that once happened. Do we have proof? No, but we have reasons to entertain the possibility without surrendering critical judgment. We have the persistent Mesopotamian habit of placing origins before the flood, and of imagining civilization as restoration rather than invention. We have the Sumerian king list, which divides history into pre-flood and post-flood periods, implying that cities and kingship existed before catastrophe and were restored afterward. We have flood traditions that speak of antediluvian cities and rulers, as if knowledge of a pre-flood world was genuinely believed to have been inherited. We have the seriousness with which these texts were preserved, not as entertainment, but as foundational knowledge, copied in temples and royal libraries across centuries. And we have the structure of the story itself, which does not feel like pure invention. It feels like an explanation struggling to make sense of something inherited, a memory that no longer has clear details, but whose shape remains. If you hold this reading gently, it suggests that the Sumerians and their successors saw themselves not as the first civilization, but as the restorers of civilization, not as inventors of cities and kingship and labour, but as inheritors of a system that was already old when they found it, or when they were assigned to it. In that view, the Igigi rebellion is the mythic memory of how that assignment happened, how labour shifted from one group to another, how humans became the ones responsible for maintaining the world. This reading does not require us to believe in ancient astronauts or lost super civilizations. It only requires us to consider that the Mesopotamians might have been preserving very old memories, memories transformed by time into mythic form, but memories nonetheless. The problems with this reading are substantial. First, it asks us to accept transmission across timescales that strain credibility. If the rebellion happened before recorded history, how could memory of it survive? Oral tradition can preserve stories, but over thousands of years, details blur and transform beyond recognition. What remains, at best, is structure, patterns of crisis and resolution, but not clear historical content. Second, this reading can slide too easily into speculation. Without corroborating evidence, archaeological, textual, genetic, we cannot verify that these stories preserve deep historical memory rather than being later inventions. The desire to find hidden history in myths is strong, but it can lead us to see patterns that are not there, or to overinterpret ambiguities as secrets. Third, this reading risks romanticizing the text. It turns the Mesopotamians into mystical custodians of ancient truth, rather than seeing them as people like us, making sense of their world with the tools they had, sometimes accurately, sometimes not. Still, the preservation reading deserves space, not as certainty, but as possibility, because if we dismiss it too quickly, we may miss something the ancient scribes were trying to tell us. Not that gods literally rebelled, but that the world as they knew it was built on an old crisis, an old reorganization, an old transfer of burden, and that humans, in their view, inherited the outcome of that transfer. Whether the crisis was literal or symbolic, whether it happened in heaven or in early human society, the result is the same. We carry the work, we maintain the order, we preserve the knowledge, and the tablets themselves are proof that the Mesopotamians believed this role was sacred. So what do we do with 3 readings that cannot all be fully true, yet each contain truth? We hold them. We let them rest side by side. We use the first to stay grounded in scholarship. We use the second to stay connected to human experience. We use the third to stay open to the possibility that the ancients knew something we have forgotten. And we acknowledge that the same evidence can sustain all 3, because ancient texts are dense enough to carry multiple meanings at once. They were written by people who thought in layers. They were preserved by people who saw value in complexity. And they reach us across millennia, still capable of generating questions we cannot fully answer. That is not a weakness. That is the sign of a living tradition, one that continues to speak, because it refuses to be reduced to a single meaning. And now, with 3 readings held gently in mind, we can move into the final implication. If the Mesopotamians preserved this story, then preservation itself becomes the question. Who were they preserving it for? What did they think would be lost if the memory faded? And what does it mean that we are the ones who found it again, thousands of years later, still asking the same question they asked? What does it mean to carry a world forward? If the Sumerians preserved knowledge, who were they preserving it for? There is a way to listen to these stories that changes them. Instead of treating them as inventions, you treat them as inheritances. You treat a tablet not as the first time something was imagined, but as the latest time something was remembered. And then the question becomes almost unavoidable. If the scribes of Mesopotamia preserved the story of the Igigi, preserved the memory of burden, of refusal, of a solution found under pressure, who were they preserving it for? Because a story like this does not flatter the listener. It tells you that you exist to bear work. It tells you that the world's order was arranged before you arrived. It tells you that authority, when it is disturbed, responds by redistributing burden. So why copy it? Why teach it? Why press it again into clay in neat wedge marks, generation after generation, as if the world depended on that memory remaining available? One answer is practical, and we have already touched it. A society built on irrigation and coordinated labour needs an explanation for why labour is sacred. Canals do not dig themselves. Fields do not water themselves. Walls do not rise unless many hands lift mud brick in rhythm. In such a place, a myth that turns work into cosmic necessity is not simply literature, it is social glue. It binds people to the idea that their effort is not random suffering, but participation in the maintenance of order. It transforms exhaustion into meaning. It transforms obligation into honour. And it makes refusal not merely difficult, but unthinkable, because to refuse is not just to defy a king or a temple, but to threaten the cosmic structure itself. That is a powerful tool for governance, and we should not be naive about it. The Mesopotamian ruling classes, priests, kings, administrators, had every reason to promote stories that naturalised labour obligations. But there is another answer, quieter, and perhaps closer to the strange gravity of your title. What if the scribes preserved the Igigi rebellion because they believed it was part of the deep history of the world? Not history as we would write it today, with dates and evidence and peer review, but history as they understood it, a chain of remembered upheavals that explained why things are arranged as they are. In that worldview, the rebellion is not entertainment, it is origin. And origins are not optional to preserve. Origins are the foundation stones of meaning. That is why the Mesopotamian record is filled with beginnings. Beginnings of kingship, beginnings of cities, beginnings of work, beginnings of the flood, beginnings of decrees, beginnings of the separation of heaven and earth. Everything important has an origin story, because origin stories tell you not just where something came from, but why it must continue. And when you place the Igigi rebellion among these beginnings, it begins to look like one more hinge event, one more turning point that separates a before from an after. Before the rebellion, divine beings bore the work. After the rebellion, humans bore the work. That is not a small change. That is the creation of the human condition as Mesopotamia framed it. And now notice how this aligns with another Mesopotamian obsession, the division of time by catastrophe. The flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, kingship descended from heaven. Before the flood, there were antediluvian cities and rulers whose reigns lasted for impossible spans. After the flood, there were historical cities and mortal kings. Even when the details vary from text to text, the structure remains. A rupture, then a restoration. The world as we know it is always post-catastrophe. Civilization is always what comes after. So if you hold the rebellion in the same structural frame, you can feel its function. It is a rupture in heaven, and the restoration is humanity. This is why the title Anunnaki War can be approached without turning it into spectacle. If the conflict is about burden and authority, then the war is the struggle to maintain order when the system's lower layer refuses. And the outcome, humans created to bear the burden, becomes the most consequential peace treaty imaginable, a settlement written into the fabric of human life. But there is a tension that remains, and it matters deeply. Because if humans were created to replace the Igigi as labour bearers, then humans are, in a sense, the descendants of rebellion, not the descendants of the rebels' victory, the descendants of the solution imposed after rebellion, the descendants of compromise, reorganisation, and the transfer of burden downward. That has implications for how we understand early civilization. It suggests that the Sumerians and their successors may have seen themselves as inheritors of an old burden, one not chosen, but assigned. And in that view, cities are not triumphs of freedom. Cities are institutions of maintenance. Temples are not just houses of worship. Temples are administrative centres where the world's stability is managed through ritual, offering, and record-keeping. Kings are not merely strongmen. Kings are the human faces of a cosmic mandate, tasked with sustaining order so catastrophe does not return. This does not prove that the rebellion was historical, but it suggests why the rebellion was remembered. Because a civilization that thinks in terms of inherited order will preserve the stories that define what was inherited, and from whom, and at what cost. And that may be the deepest reason clay tablets exist at all. Not because humans love writing for its own sake, but because memory is fragile, and without memory, the restored world collapses back into noise and flood and the silence that came before cities. If the Sumerians preserved knowledge, they were preserving it for the same reason their myths say humans exist, to keep the system from breaking again, to maintain what was rebuilt after the last catastrophe, to carry forward what would otherwise be lost. And if that is true, then the Igigi rebellion is not simply a myth about gods. It is a myth about why memory must be carried, even when it is heavy, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it tells you that your role is not to invent, but to maintain, even when it tells you that freedom is not the goal, continuity is. This is a profoundly different philosophy from the modern ideal of progress and liberation, but it is a philosophy that made sense in the world the Mesopotamians lived in, a world where a broken irrigation system meant starvation, a world where a collapsed wall meant invasion, a world where a forgotten ritual might anger the gods and invite disaster. In such a world, preservation is survival, and the greatest honour is not to be original, but to be faithful, to copy accurately, to remember clearly, to pass on what was received. So when we ask who the scribes were preserving this knowledge for, the answer is for the next generation, and the next, and the next. For anyone who would carry the world forward after they were gone. For anyone who would need to know why work matters, why order matters, why the burden cannot simply be set down. They were preserving it for us, not because they knew we would exist, but because they assumed someone would. Someone would find the tablets, someone would read the wedges, someone would ask the same question they asked. How do we keep the world from falling apart? And the answer encoded in the Igigi rebellion is both harsh and strangely comforting. The world has fallen apart before. The divine order has been disrupted before, and yet order was restored. Burden was reassigned. Work continued. And here we are, millennia later, still digging canals, literal or metaphorical, still building cities, still maintaining systems, still asking what it means to carry something forward. The Mesopotamians would recognize us. They would see us as inheritors of the same task, and they would tell us, perhaps, that this is not tragedy, this is continuity. This is what it means to be human, to be the ones who carry the work the gods refused. And if you let that idea settle gently, it begins to explain the mood of Mesopotamian civilization itself, a mood that is not optimistic in the modern sense, but is deeply committed to endurance, a mood that assumes collapse is always possible, and that the only defence against collapse is to remember, to preserve, to carry forward, a mood that treats the past not as dead weight, but as instruction, as blueprint, as the inherited map for how to restore order after it breaks. And now, with that mood in mind, we can move into the final return, not toward a shouted conclusion, not toward a dramatic reveal, but toward the same calm place we started, a tablet, a fragment, a story pressed into clay, and a quiet closing thought, like a lamp being turned down, like a hand gently setting down a burden at the end of a long day. The vault door closes softly, and the ancient argument rests. The vault door closes softly. Return, in your mind, to the tablet, not to the myth in your imagination, but to the object itself. A piece of clay once soft enough to receive the pressure of a reed stylus. A piece of clay later baked hard enough to survive fire, collapse and burial. A piece of clay broken, incomplete, and yet still legible enough that we can feel a story through it. It is difficult to hold an ancient tablet without feeling time in your hands. Not time as a concept, time as weight, time as distance, time as the quiet fact that people lived, worked, argued, feared floods, built walls, worshipped, suffered, loved, and then disappeared, while their writing remained. When you look at the wedge marks, you are not only looking at language, you are looking at discipline. A scribe learnt those marks through repetition, through correction, through years of practice in a tablet house where young hands ached from pressing reeds into clay, where eyes strained in lamplight, where memory was tested again and again until the signs became automatic. And when that scribe copied an old story, whether about the Igigi or the flood or kingship descending from heaven, he was performing a kind of obedience. Obedience to tradition, obedience to memory, obedience to the idea that what came before must not be lost. That is the heart of the Mesopotamian archive. It is not simply a collection of myths, it is a technology of continuity, and that technology was built on the backs of countless scribes who believed that their labour, the labour of copying, of preserving, of transmitting, was as essential as the labour of digging canals or building temples, because without the tablets there would be no memory, and without memory there would be no way to restore order after catastrophe. The city might be rebuilt, but the knowledge of how to maintain it, how to govern it, how to keep it aligned with cosmic truth, that knowledge would be lost. So what does the Igigi rebellion become in that frame? It becomes less like a sensational tale and more like a preserved pressure point, a remembered moment when a burden became unbearable, a remembered moment when authority was forced to respond, a remembered moment when the world's arrangement changed and humans entered the picture as the new bearers of work. If you read it as myth, it explains why humans work. If you read it as social memory, it preserves the shape of labour and hierarchy, the emotional truth of what it feels like to be burdened beyond endurance, and what happens when systems break. If you read it as deep historical memory, it suggests that the Sumerians thought civilization itself was an inherited restoration after an upheaval beyond ordinary time, a primordial reorganization whose outcome we still live inside. None of these readings needs to cancel the others. The tablets do not demand a single interpretation. They demand patience. They demand that we hold ambiguity the way we hold a fragile object, carefully, respectfully, without crushing it with certainty. And perhaps that is the most sleep-friendly truth in this whole investigation. We do not have to solve it tonight. We only have to sit with it. We only have to let it rest in the mind the way a tablet rests on a shelf, present, available, waiting for the next hand to pick it up and ask the same old questions. Because the value of these ancient texts is not that they give us a final answer. The value is that they reveal how ancient people framed existence. They framed existence as maintenance, as burden carried forward, as order restored again and again after rupture, as knowledge preserved so that the next generation could find its place inside the same vast structure. So when your title says Sumerian texts reveal the Igigi rebellion against Enlil, we can allow the promise to remain open rather than forcing it into a conclusion. The texts reveal a pattern of strain and response, a pattern of hierarchy and refusal, a pattern of authority challenged and then reorganized, a pattern of solutions that descend downward, turning gods into administrators and humans into inheritors. And the name Enlil, hovering over all of it, becomes the name of constraint, the office of decree that makes order possible and also makes rebellion inevitable. Because any system that imposes burdens will eventually face resistance, and the only question is how that resistance is resolved. In the Mesopotamian answer, resistance is resolved not by eliminating burden, but by reassigning it. The work does not vanish, it moves. And once it moves to humanity, the rest of history, kingship, temples, cities, law, ritual becomes the structure that keeps humans carrying it. That is not a comfortable inheritance, but it may be an honest one. And honesty in the ancient world was often more valued than comfort. So let the last thought be gentle, like the sound of a tablet being set down on a shelf after the day's copying is finished. If the Igigi once refused to carry the work, and humans were created to carry it instead, then every act of building, every act of maintaining, every act of keeping something alive in a fragile world is part of that old story, not as proof, as possibility, as pattern, as the shape of how civilizations think about themselves when they are honest about what it costs to keep the lights on, the canals flowing, the walls standing, the knowledge alive. And the pattern is quiet enough now to let you sleep. If this story resonated with you, you can leave a note in the comments where you're listening from, what time it is there, what question you're still holding, because the ancient arguments are never truly finished. They are only passed forward. And now you are part of that chain. You have heard the story of the Igigi. You have walked through the museum halls, through the buried libraries, through the fragments and the scholarly debates. You have held 3 readings in mind without forcing one to be the only truth. And you have arrived at the same place the Mesopotamian scribes arrived at again and again at the end of a long day of copying. The work is heavy, the distress is much, but the work continues. And in that continuation, there is something like meaning, something like honour, something like the quiet knowledge that you are part of a chain longer than any single life, a chain of hands that pass tablets forward, that pass memory forward, that pass the burden forward, so the world does not collapse back into silence. The vault door closes softly. The tablet returns to its rest behind glass. The wedge marks hold their shape in the controlled light, waiting for the next question, the next reader, the next generation that will ask. What did they know? What were they trying to tell us? And why does it still matter? The answers are there, pressed into clay, broken but not lost. And the rebellion, whether divine, social, or something older than words can hold, remains what it always was, a memory of the moment when the world nearly broke and then was rebuilt, a memory of burden transfer, a memory of why we are here, carrying forward what came before, not because we chose it, but because it was given to us. And the ancient scribes believed that gift however heavy, was sacred, so they preserved it for us, and now we hold it, and the story rests